Hi, everybody. Welcome back. What a wonderful conversation and series of conversations this morning. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Teresa Bejan of the University of Oxford. Dr. Bejan is a graduate of the University of Chicago, Cambridge University, and Yale, and she serves as professor of political theory at the University of Oxford, as well as a fellow of Oriel College. A prolific scholar, Dr. Bejan has published dozens of articles, essays, and reviews, some edited collections, including her recent important monograph, Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration from 2017. Her research focuses on themes central to our conversation today: free speech, civility, toleration, and most recently, the evolving meaning of equality across intellectual history. Dr. Bejan's remarks this afternoon, titled Teaching the History of Ideas, Equality Before Egalitarianism, are drawn from her forthcoming book, First Among Equals. Dr. Bejan's recent work recovers a conceptual landscape in which equality did not yet imply uniformity, and where hierarchy and equality were not always seen as opposites. In an age often marked by rhetorical excesses and intellectual impatience, her work and scholarship models a disciplined return to sources, a careful attention to language, and a principled commitment to sustaining disagreement without abandoning mutual intelligibility. It's in that spirit that we welcome her today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bejan. Thank you, Teresa. Really good to have you here.
Thank you. Hello. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to Lee and to Jeremy for the invitation, and to Heather to making it work. It's a bit of a flying visit for me, but I'm really glad that we could work out my schedule to come. I've already benefited immensely from the earlier talks. They've really sparked lots of ideas. I'm sorry to have to miss the final session, but I think maybe we are all thinking about AI, and I thought I'd report that I gave a lecture at UNC last week for the Public Humanities program, and the chancellor there remarked in his introduction that AI is making the best case for the importance of a humanities education as a sort of future-proofed degree in the way that computer science is not. So make of that what you will. Okay, 250 years ago this summer, Thomas Jefferson and his co-authors presented their colleagues in the Continental Congress with a brief memorandum justifying the American colonies' formal separation from Great Britain. We know this memo today as the Declaration of Independence. And its celebrated second sentence runs as follows, and I quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," and you know the rest. Walter Isaacson calls this the greatest sentence ever written, but he arbitrarily wants to stop it after that first clause. There's no period there. Okay, here we find the self-evident proposition that all men are created equal, standing as a major premise from which revolutionary political consequences follow. For instance, that colonists can stand as equals with the greatest king and call him to account. Today, we recognize this argument as an egalitarian one, in which the basic equality of human beings grounds their political equality as citizens. And we tend to credit this argument with nothing less than having made the modern world, a world in which democracy somehow became the default expression of political legitimacy. Who saw that coming? And also human rights became the lingua franca of international law. But even as these modern egalitarian institutions are coming under increasing pressure today, many academic philosophers and political theorists have sort of continued to take this egalitarian argument for granted as an unremarkable feature of the political landscape. We rarely stop to wonder where it came from and whether or not, I don't know, it actually works. This is not to say that my fellow academics and I are blind to the less than fully egalitarian political conclusions, for instance, with respect to women and slaves, that Jefferson and his fellow founders drew on the basis of that argument in 1776. Far from it. Only we tend to view those conclusions straightforwardly as contradictions, right? And as such, they pose no obvious problem for the soundness or coherence of the egalitarian argument itself. If anything, the problem lies with the men who made that argument in 1776. Men like Jefferson, who could somehow proclaim that the law of nature and nature's God had created all men equal on the one hand, and then participate personally and profit from the enormity of chattel slavery on the other. Now, I mean, I hate to break it to you, maybe you know, Jefferson would hardly be the first egalitarian to conclude that some people were in fact more equal than others. But on this view, and I think it's a really prevailing view, it's the job of historians mainly to sort of chronicle the contradictions, as it were. We sort of meant to go through the history of political thought and just point out where figures in the past fell short of their own presumptively egalitarian political commitments. And I find this kind of, I'm someone who wears both hats, right? I'm a political theorist on the one hand and a historian of ideas on the other. And I find this academic complacency about equality troubling for a few reasons. So firstly, it seems to me to be completely out of touch with the obvious discontent or even disillusionment with equality that we've been witnessing in the broader public sphere. And in recent years, we've seen this in particular on the progressive left. So I know that many here will no doubt be familiar with this ubiquitous internet cartoon of 2016 that's meant to illustrate why we should reject equality in favor of something called equity as an approach to social justice. Now, some of the political philosophers and theorists in this room may know what I mean when we say that. Philosophers are often puzzled by this cartoon because it purports to be a critique of equality as such, but then depicts equity as itself just another kind of equality. So here it's an equality of standing, with everyone standing shoulder to shoulder on a level as equals. But secondly, I find this kind of ongoing complacency about equality in the academic humanities in particular troubling because it assumes that people in the distant past must have meant, broadly speaking, what we do when we say that human beings are equal. And as for what we mean, well, that too is taken to be clear enough. We mean that despite the many differences between us, for instance, of race, class, or gender, or indeed individual talent or merit, every person is nonetheless the same in some fundamental respect, for instance, in their moral status or intrinsic worth. And if this is right, then surely some of the wider social, political, and indeed economic implications of the Declaration of Independence really ought to have been obvious, and as obviously egalitarian in 1776 as they are today in 2026, even if Jefferson and his co-authors didn't always see this or act on it consistently themselves. And yet, if we dig a little deeper, we find that the meaning of equality has historically been somewhat less than self-evident, certainly less self-evident than its veneer of mathematical certainty suggests. So, if you'll permit me, let us journey together into the history of equality before egalitarianism. So today, we tend to understand equality primarily in abstract or even arithmetic terms as a relationship of quantitative identity or sameness. And indeed, this is where the equality-equity meme takes off, in complaining that equality adopts an inappropriately arithmetic or one-size-fits-all to justice. It presents equity as something less rigid, something more responsive to real-world circumstances. But if we look to the ancient world, we find that philosophers like Plato and Aristotle actually took quite a lot of trouble to distinguish equality from sameness and other conceptual relations. So if we look to Aristotle's metaphysics, we find him distinguishing clearly between equality as a relationship of oneness with respect to quantity, from sameness and similarity as oneness with respect to essence and to quality, respectively. And so what emerges in Aristotle's discussion in the Metaphysics is a peculiarly negative conception of equality as what Aristotle calls a contradiction by privation. And I quote, "The equal then is that which is neither great nor small, but would naturally be either great or small." So in other words, for Aristotle, there's something exceptional about equality as the absence of difference where one would normally expect to find it. This ancient understanding of what I call equality as indifference, as the absence of difference, may seem strange to us at first, but consider the common phrase, c'est m'est égal, or ist mir egal in French or German, right? Which means it's all the same to me, it's all equal to me. In English, literally, it's all equal to me, in the sense that it's a matter of indifference. I don't care. If we fast forward in time from Aristotle to the 18th century, we find an even wider range of associations. So consider Samuel Johnson's celebrated Dictionary of the English Language, originally published in 1755, and then reissued in 1773, so only 3 years before the Declaration. Here we find no fewer than 8 definitions of the adjective equal, including that peculiarly negative or privative Aristotelian formulation of neither greater nor less, neither worse or better, as well as indifferent, which I just mentioned, but also like another in bulk, excellence, or any other quality admitting of comparison. And if we return to the Declaration with these competing definitions in mind, we can see pretty quickly that the normative and particularly the political implications of equality are going to change depending on what sense of equality we have in view. And there's a really lovely historical example of this. So when the Declaration was first translated into Japanese in the 19th century, the translator really stumbled over the phrase, all men are equal, and eventually translated it as, quote, all persons are created in the same rut or wagon track. Right? It isn't obvious what political consequences should follow. Right, from such an indifferent form of creation, right? Certainly it doesn't suggest that all persons should also be considered sufficiently alike to stand as equals politically as peers. This historical ambiguity of equality may help to explain why claims to natural or universal human equality were actually absent from the most democratic and inclusive society in the ancient world, namely classical Athens. So in Athens, for instance, only a select subset of the city's inhabitants, namely native-born adult male Athenians in good standing, were deemed intrinsically worthy or weighty enough to count politically as equals or isoi. So Hannah Arendt, who was shouted out earlier. Hannah Arendt, I think, was right when she described political equality in Athens as, quote, the equality of those who form a body of peers, in the sense that they are people who are publicly recognized and indeed recognize one another as being similarly superior to others. So Athenian women, of course, slaves, non-Greek barbarians, right, because they speak gibberish, they go bar, 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 and also Greek resident aliens. So this includes people like Aristotle, who's a citizen of Stagira. From the perspective of the Athenian democracy, he was not good enough to count as an equal. And yet, an idea of natural and universal human equality can indeed be found in the ancient world, if not in democratic Athens. We're going to find it in maybe an unexpected place, namely the Roman Empire. And I'll come back to say a little bit about what that meant, what equality meant in Rome in a second. But for now, I just want to notice that the puzzle of the Declaration actually deepens when we realize that far from being the bedrock of modernity, as, for instance, Danielle Allen and others have presented it, the claim that all humans are equal is actually a very ancient claim. And it has deep roots in Roman law, and indeed also in Christianity. And worse, for most of its history, the claim of human equality was seen as not only consistent with, but actually supportive of, a whole host of hierarchical relations. And many that modern egalitarians would view as obviously objectionable, so not just sexism and slavery, but also monarchy and universal empire. Indeed, it's only in England in the 17th century, or so I argue in my forthcoming book, that we begin to see this ancient commonplace becoming a basis on which ordinary people, men and women, could make political demands. And specifically, they could demand to stand as equals with the most privileged members of their societies. So given this, it seems that the right question for philosophers and theorists, as well as historians, is not how a paragon of 18th century enlightenment like Thomas Jefferson could somehow fail to grasp some of the more obvious implications of his own argument. It's rather why an ancient commonplace, seen for centuries as supportive of hierarchy, became so suddenly and spectacularly effectual as a premise of political argument. So to answer the latter question, we've got to move from the summer of 1776 to the summer of 1646, when a man and a distant relative of Thomas Jefferson, named John Lilburne, found himself once again in a London jail. Now, Lilburne is remembered today, if he's remembered at all, as a leader of the Leveller movement, active during the English Civil War, and the Levelers are remembered for their participation in the Putney debates of 1647, during which they called for a radical expansion of the parliamentary franchise almost 300 years before universal manhood suffrage became a reality in modern Britain. So the speech given by Colonel Rainborough at Putney in defense of the Leveler principle of equal voice is justly famous, and I quote, "For really I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live is the greatest he, and therefore truly, sir, I think it's clear that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government, that he hath not had a voice to put himself under." So raise your hand if you've heard this quotation before. Okay. One 20th century historian called this the straightest and simplest claim for equality ever made in human history. So you should know it, okay? But the groundwork for Rainborough's argument at Putney had been laid the previous summer by Lilburne, at a moment when Freeborn John, as he was popularly known, was simply a celebrity activist, one with a talent for getting himself thrown in prison on behalf of various causes that always sort of happened to align with whatever his personal grievance was at the time. He had a highly developed sense of personal grievance. Today, I think we would describe Lilburne as an outrage entrepreneur. There you go. So in the summer of 1646, Lilburne found himself on trial again, but this time before the House of Lords. So hauled before the House for denouncing the Earl of Manchester, Lilburne had refused to answer the charge. And worse, he had refused to kneel or to remove his hat, denying that the so-called peers had any authority to judge a commoner like himself. Now confined to Newgate Prison, Lilburne shot off a pamphlet in protest. It was entitled "The Free Man's Freedom Vindicated," and it contained the following postscript containing a general proposition. God, the absolute sovereign Lord and King, gave man, his mere creature, the sovereignty under himself, and thereby created him after his own image. Hence, every particular and individual man and woman that ever breathed into the world since Adam and Eve, who are and were by nature all equal and alike in power, dignity, authority, and majesty, none of them having by nature any authority, dominion, or magisterial power, one over above another, but merely by mutual agreement or consent. Sound familiar, right? Here, 130 years before the Declaration, we find Lilburne insisting that every man and woman is created equal, and moreover, that this creational equality, if you will, has political implications, right? It matters for their social and political arrangements. Now, the peers, alas, were unpersuaded. They condemned Lilburne to 7 years in the Tower of London under strict instructions that he not publish any more pamphlets. Those instructions proved futile. It didn't matter. So over the next 5 years, Lilburne and his supporters, who will become known as the Levelers, undertake a tireless print and popular protest campaign in defense not just of Lilburne's rights, but of the rights of every freeborn Englishman. So in hindsight, we can see that all of the Levelers' political demands, including the remarkable demand for equal voice at Putney, flowed naturally, as it were, from Lilburne's proposition. But if you visit the National Archives in London, you'll see that the parliamentary prosecutors who were charged with scouring Lilburne's pamphlet for criminality, which they found plenty, as we'll see a bit later, they passed over his proposition entirely without comment. So the whole rest of the pamphlet is completely marked up with the prosecutor's notes and underlining, but the postscript is just completely blank. The backside is used to do some sums in the margin. So why? This seems remarkable to us, right? Why? Well, the Lord's indifference, if you will, I think can be explained by the ubiquity and indeed the political ambiguity of equality as a political ideal in early modern England. So indeed, over a decade before Lilburne had penned his proposition, John Locke's bête noire, Filmer, Sir Richard Filmer, author of Patriarcha, had complained that the supposed natural equality of mankind, and I quote, had become a truth unquestionable, even among his fellow theorists of divine right monarchy. Hence, equity, Filmer tells us, equity requires that an ear be reserved for the negative, that is, that all human beings were unequal by nature. Filmer traced this error, as he called it, of natural equality to Ulpian, a Roman jurist of the 2nd century CE, who is recorded in the Digest as having written the following. With respect to the civil law, slaves are regarded as nothing, nullus, but as far as concerns the natural law, omnes homines aequales sunt, all humans are equal. Full stop. In this passage, we find Ulpian, as an imperial jurist and a close advisor to the Emperor Caracalla, making a familiar claim, namely that all humans, even slaves, are equal under natural law. In context, however, this is clearly not the statement of egalitarian principle that modern readers might expect. Ulpian was not saying that all people, even slaves, ought to be treated as equals politically, let alone afforded equal human rights. His point, rather, was that slaves who lacked legal capacity according to the Roman civil law, and were therefore treated as objects, not legal subjects, those slaves were nonetheless bound by so-called natural law, to which all human beings were equally subject as members of the same natural species. In other words, much like the sun, the rain, or death, the law fell indifferently on everyone, right? No matter their condition. That is, without taking the often extreme inequalities of wealth, status, or power between them into account. All human beings, a more positive way of putting this, all human beings are creatures capable of law and capable of legal responsibility. So from the limited perspective of the civil law with respect to Roman citizens and of the natural law with respect to human beings, the many inequalities and other differences between us are matters of indifference. So here we can see in Roman imperial thought, equality is not a reflection of the intrinsic worth of human beings, let alone citizens, in the sense that it was in Athens. Instead, it's fundamentally the sense of indifference. And specifically, in Rome, the equality as indifference of legal subjects is seen itself as a kind of reflection of the law's own equality. And here we have a sense of equality becoming a virtue, an epistemic virtue of restraint or impartiality, the kind of the unwillingness to take irrelevant differences into account. So here I think we can begin to see the origins of that sort of the modern equity critique of legal equality as offering a kind of one-size-fits-all or sort of colorblind often approach to social justice, right? The law refuses to take these differences into account. So to turn from Roman law to Christianity, in the New Testament, we find this distinctly Roman understanding of equality as indifference being adopted by the early Christians as a basis for divine justice. Consider the famous episode in the Acts when St. Peter addresses the Roman centurion Cornelius, telling him that the Christian God is, unlike the Roman law, quote, no respecter of persons. The Greek, it's aprosopolemptos. So Acts 10:34 will later become one of the leveler's favorite proof texts, even more so than Genesis 1:26, 1:27, which we saw Lilburn invoking in his proposition. But in the New Testament itself, the implications of divine equality remain profoundly hierarchical. Specifically, Christianity promises that its God will treat all of his creatures equally, in the sense that he will reward or punish them according only to their spiritual merits, not their external personae, in their sense of public faces or positions, right? He's going to elevate and degrade them accordingly. And what will happen is that there will be a complete inversion by which the last shall be first. Taking a step back, I think we're now in a position to see why, for well over a millennium, a commitment to human equality did not an egalitarian make. It's not because Roman jurists were bad at math, or because the early Christians were blind to the so-called dogmas of their faith. It's because people in the past simply moved much less easily than we do from the claim that all humans are equal or indifferent, for instance, in the eyes of God or of the law, to the claim that they should therefore also be treated as equals or peers with respect to their social or spiritual, let alone political, standing. Indeed, the purpose of equality on this view was really to bring the many ethical and evaluative disparities between different individuals and social groups into sharper relief as a basis for hierarchical relations. And so, much as a meritocracy, the point of equality is to justify inequality on this view. So what's going on here? Well, I think the nature of the gap becomes clearer when we realize that in classical and post-classical Latin, there's a distinction to be found, and that they distinguish in a way that modern English does not, between being equal, or equalis on the one hand, with respect to some quantitative or juridical measure, and being peers, or pares, on the other, in a social and evaluative sense. So consider the phrase primus inter pares, from which I take my title. This was traditionally a title of distinction awarded to the most senior member of the Roman Senate. And although it's usually translated into English as first among equals, it means literally first among peers. That is, those who are alike in excellence, so that they are similarly superior to others and distinguished as a class apart. That's for well over a millennium in the Latin-speaking West. To say that omnes homines aequales sunt, or all humans are equal, was simply not to say that they were also peers, or pares, entitled to political standing, let alone to an equal voice in parliamentary elections. So I think that this largely forgotten linguistic and conceptual distinction between equality on the one hand and parity on the other is crucial if we want to make sense of that puzzle that I presented to you earlier, namely why, for so much of its history, the idea of human equality failed to issue in any recognizably egalitarian political consequences. But it also points us some way towards a solution. It seems that in order for a person to be able to demand standing as an equal with the privileged, she must first be acknowledged as a peer, or indeed their peer, in some salient respect, perhaps her free birth, right? And that brings us back to so-called freeborn John, in the summer of 1646, and his proposition that every man and woman that ever breathed are and were by nature all equal and alike in power, dignity, authority, and majesty. So much for indifference. In Lilburn's statement, we find him drawing on both of these traditions I've mentioned, so the Roman legal tradition and the Christian tradition, while also fundamentally reimagining what it means to be equal. For Lilburn now, every man and woman is not only equal as a rational being capable of law, but also alike in power, dignity, authority, and majesty. So philosophers will generally describe these as positional goods, which is simply to say that their goodness, or they're only positively valuable insofar as they are unequally distributed throughout a population. So imagine, so my majesty does me no good if you have the same majesty, or our majesty gets us nowhere. But what Lilburn is saying, paradoxically here, is that every man and woman is sufficiently alike with respect to these positional goods to be acknowledged as peers in their social and political standing, on the model, indeed, of English aristocrats. What Lilburn has done, in effect, is to erase the peer-equal distinction in order to claim the benefits of peerage for commoners like himself. And he was clearly assisted in this by a more general conceptual laxness or loosening in early modern English of the kind we saw earlier in Johnson's dictionary, by which the equality-parity distinction and other philosophical distinctions from ancient Greek and classical Latin were starting to dissolve. So if we turn back to Johnson for a moment, we can see this reflected again in his dictionary. So peer now simply means equal, and the word par itself, he tells us, is no longer elegantly used except in traffic, i.e. trade. But Lilburn also noticed something that others had not, which is that in the process of this conceptual loosening, a significant sort of possibility had been opened up in Magna Carta. And specifically, the right contained therein of, quote, every free person in the realm to a trial per pares judicium suorum, that is, by the judgment of his peers, pares. So the influential English jurist, Sir Edward Coke, had translated this in his recent legal commentary as by the judgment of his peers or equals. And it just so happens that Lilburn had Coke's commentary on Magna Carta with him in prison, and he was something of a jailhouse lawyer, and he saw his opportunity and he seized it. So we can see this again in another outlined passage. You can see the prosecutorial outlining from the Freeman's Freedom Vindicated, and in which he's basically arguing, he says, the peers as you are called, so-called peers, right? He's basically arguing in this passage and others that every freeborn English man and woman has the right in England to be tried by his or her peers or equals, according to the common law. So surely he or she should also be entitled to an equal privilege with the greatest peer in the Commonwealth as in creation. The Leveler movement subsequently takes Lilburn's proposition and pushes it in this conceptual ambiguity across pamphlets and petitions and protests to the hilt. And they use this ambiguity to demand all of the privileges of peerage for commoners, including an equal voice in how and by whom they are to be governed. So the result is the egalitarian argument that we saw at the start of this lecture. We've seen it already in the way that it works through a kind of leveling up logic in Rainborough's speech at Putney, but we can see it even more clearly in the 1648 petition of an accused leveler mutineer named William Thomas. So, quote, "I am by birth a free commoner of England, and am thereby entailed or entitled unto an equal privilege with the greatest men in England, unto the freedom and liberty of the laws of England, including to the lawful judgment of his peers or equals, my peers or equals." So note that deliberately aristocratic language there of entail and entitlement. But my favorite example comes in a leveler women's petition of 1649, the preamble of which reads as follows, quote, "That since we are assured of our creation in the image of God, equal unto men, we cannot but wonder and grieve that we should appear so despicable in your eyes as to be thought unworthy to petition this honorable house." So here, a good century and a half before Mary Wollstonecraft, whom we often hear invented feminism by applying the insights of the French Revolution to the equality between the sexes, we find a group of women asserting their equal standing as women in a demand for political voice, if not exactly the same voice as their male peers, right? Notice the language of proportionality, a proportionable share. Yeah. In this way, the egalitarian formula of Lilburn's proposition lived on to become a kind of early modern meme, rehearsed across countless pamphlets and petitions, and not only by radicals, but indeed by royalists. And my favorite example of this is that you find it in the so-called first English feminist, and also staunch Tory critic of John Locke, Mary Astell. So I think if you take one thing away from my lecture today, is that English Tories invented feminism. Okay? Take that to your students. Make them read Astell. She's fantastic. And as such, that argument continued to do much more radically disruptive work than the much more famous argument from natural rights that you find, for instance, in John Locke. So Locke's influence on Jefferson is widely recognized, but I would argue that it is Lilburn's argument, not Locke's, that left the most distinctive mark upon the Declaration. And if we return the text, I think we can see these two distinct senses of equality at work. So we have indifference of legal or juridical subjects on the one hand, and the social parity or peerage of equals on the other. So we see the former in our equal creation with the kind of identical set of natural rights, and the latter in the separate and equal station to which the preamble insists that the American people are entitled, right? And so Danielle Allen has an argument about why this extends to them not only collectively but individually, and again, we find that aristocratic language of entitlement. So intriguingly, in a public letter written before his death for the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, Jefferson borrowed explicitly from another leveler, the leveler Richard Rumbold, who was executed for treason in 1685, in explicating the palpable truth at the heart of the Declaration. Quote, "The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them," unquote. Whether Jefferson was aware of his own indirect descent from no less a leveler than Lilburn, it's impossible to say for sure. But Lilburn remained a popular name among Jefferson's extended family in Virginia. And it was so popular, in fact, that two men by that name would actually be born into slavery at Monticello during Jefferson's lifetime. So I'll just stop for a minute. Thomas Jefferson personally owned two enslaved men named Lilburn. So given freeborn John's subsequent importance for the history of abolition as the sole surviving source for the judgment known as Cartwright's case, in which England is proclaimed to be too pure an air for slaves to breathe in, Lilburn's our only source for that case, right? What are we to make of this fact? It seems like it's something worse than a contradiction. Perhaps a sick joke. Is it any wonder, then, in light of uncomfortable historical coincidences like this, that many young people today have become disillusioned with equality as a political ideal? Now, some, maybe not in this room, but I think many people might conclude from that with the New York Times 1619 Project, that our democracy's founding ideals were, quote, false when they were written, unquote. Others might insist, with Danielle Allen, that this only really proves the untapped radicalism of the Declaration. After all, the truth or falsity of moral principles, like mathematical ones, doesn't depend on whether they're observed. But for me, the often uncomfortable history of equality before egalitarianism, as well as after it, simply reminds us that far from being simple, let alone self-evident, the claim that all humans are equal can convey a number of competing and often contradictory ideas about human beings and their relations. And this suggests that the problem with equality is not that it's empirically false or empty, as conservatives sometimes claim, but rather that it's overburdened with historical meaning, many of which meanings are in significant tension with each other. Is it any wonder, then, that we will continue to talk past each other when we talk about equality, despite its promise that better measurement or reasoning ought to resolve our disagreements? So to return to that contemporary debate between equality and equity, it seems to me that treating people equally can indeed mean treating everyone exactly the same, for instance, by ignoring or downplaying their racial differences or other kinds of differences, as proponents of equity argue. But it can also mean respecting everyone as equals in their social and political standing in a way that takes those differences into account. And indeed, I think that's what most proponents of equity actually have in mind when you really kind of push them. But as critics of equity on the right often point out, respecting people's differences has a way of allowing those differences to harden into new, hierarchically ordered distinctions, according to which some people end up counting as more equal than others. And one might conclude again from this that we would indeed be better off as scholars and citizens if we were to reject equality in favor of some other less historically ambiguous ideal. But that would be a mistake in my view, because I think what history does for us, it tells us that the problem with equality has also been the source of its uncommon power as a political ideal. So without that complexity, Lilburn and the Levelers could not have crafted this argument that traded silently on the many different meanings of equality in order to demand a political voice, not only for English commoners, men, but women and the working poor. Now, Lilburn's better educated critics recognized his egalitarian argument for what it was, namely a non sequitur. It simply doesn't follow from the fact that we are equal or indifferent by nature, or in the eyes of God, that we should also be treated as peers politically. Accordingly, Lilburn's critics mocked him, and there's like great sort of, William Prynne called him an upstart monstrous lawyer called to the bar at Newgate Prison where he now practiceth. It's great. But I argue that it's precisely Lilburn's bad Latin and lack of formal legal training that allows him to deploy this ancient language of equality to new political ends. And in making his argument, an argument that's immediately taken up by others, men and women, levelers and non-levelers, both he and they managed to sort of make that bad argument true by thinking and speaking for themselves and demanding their own place in a society of equals. And I think, just in the spirit of this workshop, I think that's partly what I see myself as doing in the seminar, right? It's a hierarchically ordered space, but it's a space in which we come with all of these inequalities and yet sort of forge a parity of standing and a parity of voice in which we come to regard each other as peers and equals. And so rather than rejecting equality as a political ideal, I think we can and should redeem it by restoring some of its normative complexity. Doing so promises not only to clarify our own thinking with respect to equality's normative demands, but I think it also promises to reframe some of our most inherently intractable political disagreements in a more constructive and indeed a more civil way. So just to give you an example, in that supposed conflict between equality and equity, we've already seen that participants on both sides are kind of trading on just two different senses of equality. So conservatives often propose to reduce equality to procedural indifference in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of meritocratic institutions. And many progressives reject that approach in favor of a more robust parity of standing that treats people as peers in a way that takes their differences into account. This suggests that what's at stake, however, is not a zero-sum conflict between those who are for equality and those who are against it. Rather, it's a battle of emphasis over those who would elevate or prioritize one idea or aspect of equality over and above another. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the history I've recovered in this lecture, I hope, will encourage all of you here as teachers, as you go back to your students, to see that the egalitarian argument of the Declaration was itself a historical achievement, and it's not a particularly stable historical achievement. And as such, that achievement owes a great deal more to activists and autodidacts like Lilburn than it does to great philosophers like Locke. And if I'm right in this, then the work of maintaining Lilburn's argument, or better yet, sustaining its plausibility, rests less on coming up with ever more sophisticated philosophical accounts of the underlying basis of equality, let alone doubling down on our commitment to equality as a slogan fit for placing on a progressive placard in one's lawn. Rather, that work requires that we, in that wonderful phrase of the 2010s, do the work. 2020s, that we do the work. And it's the work of attending to, as well as just attending to, the kind of practice of equality and parity in the spaces we inhabit, and sort of really going back to those increasingly uncommon offline sites in which we actually encounter other people who are not like us in bulk or indeed in excellence, and nevertheless come together and relate as peers and equals on a daily basis. So of course for Lilburn, this was the jury. We might think of the church or the congregation. And again, I always think about the classroom. Because if history tells us anything, it's that equality is not primarily an idea to be believed in or a partisan commitment to affirm, but first and indeed foremost, something people do and something that they did. And in this way, we are and were created equal. Not by the law of nature and nature's God necessarily, but by each other every day. So thank you.
We have time, I think, for one question. It was a very rich conversation, so I'm sorry to limit to one question.
I think, is it right that it's 1:30? Maybe we can have more than one question.
You're the boss.
Okay. Sam's going to keep me on time. Yeah, Michael.
Thank you for this. This is completely fascinating and illuminating in all kinds of ways. I wanted to ask you, I genuinely don't, this is not a loaded question, I genuinely don't know the answer to it, is the religious kind of story largely it's been a secular story that you've been telling. The Levelers have a certain kind of religious inspiration as well, and in addition, a different term that's conjoined, I think, in the Levelers statement, but is not otherwise conjoined, but it's kind of interesting to think about, and has a perhaps different history, is like the concept of human dignity, or kind of like universal human dignity, which some like James Hankins makes the argument that you don't actually see that before Christianity. So just wondering how, I know it's a large and complex question, but how the religious bears on the story that you're really beautifully telling.
Absolutely. So it's a complex question to which I shall not do justice, but just be very positive and say, this is a competing story. So I think I'm interested in kind of the debates about human dignity. I tend to think that the idea of human dignity really is a kind of like, anyway, look, maybe I won't say that. I'll say that human dignity does not do the work that we want it to. Particularly, I'm interested in how you attach this kind of claim about some universal equality or dignity and like generate these concrete political demands from it. So the book became twice as long as I'd planned because I really did go back into the history of theology and political thought and Roman law to try to find dispositive cases of my thesis, and I could not find them. So I invite you all to come and do this. My story is also a kind of alternative to the Genesis Imago Dei account, so whether you figure that in terms of dignity or something else. Basically, what you get in Genesis is an argument much like you found in the Stoics or the Sophists, which is a kind of human similarity account. So it's the similarity of human beings to the divine and to one another. And I think that the equality idea is really a juridical idea. And what I argue in the book is that what happens is that Roman converts to Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, most famously St. Augustine, but St. Cyprian, Lactantius, who are all trained in Roman law and legal rhetoric, reinterpret this account in terms of these Roman legal concepts and categories. So that's kind of my story. Christianity adds loads, though, and particularly what it adds is an idea of intrinsic human worth, of the kind that you saw in Athens as being restricted only to certain citizens, as having a kind of intrinsic worth, right? So now in Christianity, everyone has intrinsic worth, but in the New Testament, at least, it's not obvious that that work is equal. I think it's pretty obvious it's not equal. Yeah.
One more question, Tom?
Is it all right with you?
Yeah,
Right.
please.
Thank you. So as you're speaking, I was thinking of another passage in Aristotle. This is really a political theory question. I'll get to practice. In Book 3, Chapter 12, he says, everyone thinks justice is two things, the common good and equality. And equality, he means there, is equal things to equals and unequal things to unequals. And that requires political philosophy, he says. And he also says everyone says something true about justice, but never completely. And I think he means that universally, that there's no end to this debate about the proper meaning of equality. Mm-hmm. So just establishing that and see if that maps onto what you're thinking. But the conclusion that no one speaks completely about it makes me doubt that an entirely civil, you gestured to the value of a kind of coming together with people you don't know and having civil dialogue. Insofar as different opinions about equality are not just like different, lexical problems. They're arguments about what is just. It seems to me there needs to be an awareness or acceptance that that's going to be like emphatically political and contentious,
Sure.
and not civil in the narrow way that, higher education administrators might hope a civil discourse program makes everyone, agree to disagree or something like that.
Well, if anyone familiar with my first book will know that is not my vision of civility. So.
Exactly, yeah. So,
Yeah, no, excellent question. So I'd say that Aristotle's analysis tracks mine. I interpret that discussion in the politics and ethics in terms of a kind of disagreement about equality as indifference, as a kind of procedural indifference, versus equality as a kind of proportional justice. And in the end, as Aristotle notes, actually both factions, Democrats and oligarchs, are actually committed to the proportional justice view, right? So it's a kind of reductio. They just disagree about what the criteria should be. An insight I take from Greek political thought is that equality remains somehow artificial. It's highly unnatural. And it's a kind of political achievement. So you see a kind of similar idea in the Roman context where human equality is an artifact of law. And the Romans do like the best law. Roman law is like top law. But all humans are capable of law. And so that's kind of I think that should be recovered in our thinking about equality as well. I think we lean too hard on the natural because we want it to act as a kind of pre-political or super-political principle. But in doing so, we lose sight of the kind of difficulty of making that theoretical claim feel true. And I think we really have to attend to plausibility. And I think that's what you really see in the context of leveler activism, but also in someone like Mary Astle, who says, so women, yes, are equals to men, but in nature, but we don't have educational institutions in which we can come to see ourselves as peers and equals. And without those, men are going to look at us and sort of say, really? Right? Anyway, so thank you. I'm so sorry I've got to run to the airport, but please do email me. It's been an honor to be here, and I really am wishing you all of the best here at the Chase Center.
Please join me in thanking Teresa.
Thank you.